Wyoming Territory, 1887, the rain came down cold and steady, soaking the dusty platform at the edge of Red Fern Station, where Florence Sutton stood alone with her carpetbag clutched tight to her chest. Her boots were wet through. Her hat, a new one she had stitched herself back in Ohio, sagged with rainwater. Behind her, the small depot office had long since shuttered for the evening. The station master had offered her a quick, pitying glance before riding off home. That had been an hour ago. The train had arrived on time. He had not. Florence pulled the letter from her pocket again, hands trembling from cold and something sharper. The paper was soft with wear, the ink slightly faded. "I await your arrival with joy," it read, signed in stiff handwriting by a man named Walter Greaves, a rancher. 42, widowed. No children, seeking a wife to keep his home and share his days. She had answered his advertisement through the Cincinnati Herald, writing back with hope swollen in her chest. But now, alone in the rain, Florence knew. He was not coming, or worse, he had never existed at all. Her stomach churned. She had sold her sewing machine to afford the train fare. Left her sister's crowded boarding house behind. She had no return ticket, no family west of the Mississippi. She had come here to begin again, and now she had nowhere to go. A low rumble of thunder rolled across the hills. The horses tied to the rail out front of the depot shifted nervously. She stepped off the platform, boots squelching in the mud, and walked toward the road. There was a faint glow in the distance lamplight from the town proper, a half-mile down. She would walk there. Maybe find shelter in a church or stable until morning. Then she heard it. Hoofbeats. She turned. A single rider approached from the south trail, horse-soaked and blowing steam from its nostrils. The cowboy atop it wore a long duster, wide-brimmed hat pulled low, rain dripping from its edge. As he drew closer, he slowed. His horse stopped a few paces from her. He looked down at her, saying nothing. Florence swallowed. I missed my party," she said, voice shaking. "I was supposed to be met." Still, he did not speak, but his gaze lingered, clear eyes beneath the shadow of his hat. A flicker of something moved across his face, not pity, something steadier, understanding. He dismounted wordlessly and reached into his coat. From the inside pocket, he pulled a small oilcloth pouch. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate, and opened it. Inside was a simple silver ring. He held it out to her. Florence blinked. I do not understand," the cowboy finally spoke. "You were left." His voice was low, rough as gravel, but sure. She nodded, stunned. He glanced at the ring in his palm. "I am not." Then he looked at her again. "I will not." For a long second she stared at him. Rain ran down her cheeks like tears, soaking her collar, her sleeves. Her hands were trembling. "Why?" she asked, barely above a whisper. "Why would you offer this?" He hesitated. Then said, "Because someone should." He extended the ring further. She looked at it. It was not fancy, no stone, worn at the edges, but it was clean, honest, real. "I do not even know your name," she breathed. "Quillan," he said. "Quillan Everett." Florence looked into his eyes. There was something solid in them. No charm, no coaxing, just a quiet steadiness. Like he had seen too much to waste words and still chose to stand there, offering her the one thing she thought she had lost: hope. Her fingers closed over the ring. "Florence Sutton," she said. Quillan gave the faintest nod. Then he turned, took her bag from her hand, and motioned to his horse. "Come, you are wet through." She hesitated only a moment before following. He helped her mount behind him, his hands steady as they settled her in place. She clung to the saddle horn as he swung up in front of her. The ride to his homestead was quiet. The rain softened into mist. His coat shielded her from most of the wind, and though her teeth still chattered, some part of her chest began to thaw. When they reached the cabin nestled against the edge of the pines, Florence saw light flickering through the shutters. Quillan opened the door, letting warmth spill out. Inside, the space was simple wood walls, a stone hearth, a table, a bed tucked in the far corner. It smelled like cedar and smoke. He took her coat, set her bag down, and stirred the fire with practiced ease. "You live alone?" she asked quietly. He nodded. 4 years, she looked around. "It is. Good, clean." He met her eyes. "I will not ask you for anything, not tonight." Not until you choose. Florence looked down at the ring still clutched in her hand. But you offered. He nodded once. She sat near the hearth, letting the warmth soak into her bones. He made tea from dried peppermint leaves and handed her a tin cup without a word. After a long silence, she said, I came here to marry a man I never met. I was prepared to give my life to a stranger. Quillan sat in the chair across from her, boots stretched toward the fire. And now, he asked. She looked at him, really looked, the square set of his jaw. The quiet strength in his hands, the way he had not asked her to explain herself, the way he had simply seen her standing in the rain and decided she mattered. I do not know, she said truthfully. He nodded again, as if that was an answer he respected. She sipped the tea. He added a log to the fire. That night he gave her the bed and took the floor. Morning came with a pale blue sky and the smell of coffee. Florence stood at the window and watched the sun spill across the meadow. She turned the ring in her fingers. He had not asked her again, had not pressed her. But he had kept his promise. She looked over at him, where he knelt by the stove fixing breakfast. His shoulders were broad, his movements quiet and efficient, as if he had lived years alone in silence and still remembered how to care for someone else. And for the first time since stepping off that train, Florence felt something steady rise in her chest, not just hope, but the start of trust. Florence leaned the broom against the wall, dust clinging to her cuffs and the backs of her hands. She'd cleared the corners, swept out the hearth ash, and folded the wool blanket from the floor back into the cedar chest. Her palms ached with a familiar sting work she knew well, though the tools and the silence here were different than the boarding house bustle she'd left behind. Quillan was outside splitting wood. The steady rhythm of the axe filtered through the open window above the wash basin. It had been 2 days since he'd brought her here. 2 days of quiet meals, simple chores, and the kind of cautious glances that carried more weight than words ever could. He had not brought up the ring again, nor had he touched her. But he'd left her space on the peg for her shawl and hung a fresh towel beside his own. She stepped out onto the porch, the air dry and sharp with pine. He paused mid-swing, breath misting in the cool light. There a place in town where I might earn coin? She asked. He set the axe down and looked at her, not startled, not questioning, just waiting for her to finish. I've done mending. Seam work. I can read and write, she said. I'd rather keep my own than take from you, he nodded once. Mercantiles run by the Danners. Mrs. Danner's spine ain't what it was. Florence folded her arms. Would they take to a stranger? Depends how you speak to them. I can be polite. She hesitated. You'd take me in. Quillan bent to gather the split logs into his arms. If you want to ride in, I'll hitch the wagon after supper. She watched him head toward the woodshed, the scent of fresh cut pine trailing behind him. Later, while she peeled potatoes by lantern light, she asked, You were married once. It wasn't a question, but he stopped slicing bread. His hands stilled on the crust. 6 years, he said. Her name was Alma. Florence kept her eyes on the blade in her hand. What happened? Winter fever, year the herd starved out. She said nothing, letting the silence settle. She sang to the cows, he added after a long pause. Said it kept the calves calm. Florence met his eyes. You speak little, but not without meaning, he returned to slicing. Words wear thin if you use them carelessly. She smiled faintly, though he didn't see it. After supper, he hitched the wagon without fuss. She rode beside him into town, her coat fastened tight, hands folded in her lap. The road was rutted from snowmelt and the horses moved slow. Why didn't you post for a wife? She asked without turning her head. Quillan kept his eyes on the road. Didn't figure I deserved another. Florence looked at the hills rolling dark in the distance. You think I deserve to be left? No, he said. I think some men are cowards. They reached town just as dusk settled. The mercantile's windows glowed with lamplight. He waited outside while she stepped inside alone. Mrs. Danner wore silver spectacles and a shawl pinned with bone buttons. She examined Florence from behind the counter with a look sharpened by years of measuring calico bolts. You're Mr. Everett's? She asked. Florence straightened. I am Florence Sutton. I keep his house for now. The older woman's eyes narrowed. "You sew?" Florence opened her satchel and unfolded a linen handkerchief embroidered with precise red thread. "I've done work for pastors, tailors, and a boarding school matron in Ohio, Mrs. Danner reached for it, fingers brushing the edge like she could read the needle's story. "You come mornings, 3 days a week. Store opens at 7, Florence nodded. "I'll be on time." When she stepped back into the street, the wagon was still there. Quillan didn't ask how it went. He just reached out and helped her up, his hand steady around her wrist. The ride back was darker, the stars cold above. "I've never had a horse of my own," she said after a while. "My sister's husband said women didn't need them." Quillan gave a soft sound she couldn't place. "I'd like to learn to ride," she continued. "One day." "I'll teach you," he said simply. They rode the rest of the way in quiet, the kind that didn't press or weigh down. Back at the cabin, she stoked the coals while he brought in the last logs. Before he turned toward the door, she reached into her apron pocket and held out the ring. "I'm not ready yet," she said, "but I don't want it kept away either." He looked at it a long moment, then placed it gently on the windowsill, where morning light would find it. "You'll take your time," he said, "and I'll keep mine with you." For the first time since arriving, she slept without waking. The wind shifted that morning, carrying the scent of melting snow and wet earth. Florence stepped out past the porch rail and paused at the edge of the yard, boots sinking just slightly into the thaw-softened ground. The sky was a pale, stretching blue, and in the distance, the hills had begun to shed their winter coat. She drew her shawl tighter but didn't turn back. Quillan was at the fence line, repairing a section where a cedar post had leaned loose under the weight of frost. He hadn't noticed her yet, or maybe he had and simply didn't change his rhythm. She watched him hammer the stake deeper, quiet and sure in his work, until he finally straightened and looked toward her. "I'd like to help," she said once she reached him, brushing her skirts aside to crouch. He didn't argue, just handed her the coil of wire and pointed to the next post. "Was your father a farmer?" he asked as they worked. "No," she said. "He was a watchmaker, taught me to listen more than speak." Quillan nodded once, then bent to the next loop of wire. She glanced at him. "And yours?" "Surveyor for the Pacific Rail Lines." "Ran maps out past Cheyenne long before the tracks reached there." "Did you go with him?" "Once," he said, twisting the wire taut. "Got lost in the canyon south of Rawlins. He found me after dark by the sound of my singing." Florence blinked. "You sang?" "Once," he repeated, and the edge of his mouth lifted just slightly. They finished the line in silence. She stood and stretched her back, brushing pine needles from her skirt. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked, watching the breeze stir the grass between the trees beyond the fence. "No," he said, "not anymore." She turned to him, brushing hair from her cheek. "Why?" He met her eyes. "Because here, I know how to stay." Later, she boiled water for laundry while Quillan saddled the mare for her first lesson. The sun had climbed high enough to warm the air just a touch, and the horses pawed the ground with restlessness that came with the change of season. He waited for her by the barn, reins in hand. "You'll need better boots," he said, taking in her scuffed heels. "They're all I brought west," she replied. "I'll speak to Mrs. Danner about a trade," he said. "She keeps a barrel of goods left by folks passing through." Florence stepped forward, placing her hand on the mare's neck. The animal shifted but didn't shy. "She's calmer than I expected," she said. "Knows when not to show her teeth," Quillan answered. He helped her mount, his hands on her waist firm but careful. Once she was settled, he walked beside her down the path toward the creek, keeping a hand near the bridle without holding it. "You don't ask many questions," she said, gripping the saddle horn as the horse picked its way over a rocky patch. "You answer before I need to," he said. She looked down at him. "And if I stop answering?" "Then I wait." She blinked at that, feeling something press behind her ribs, not sharp but deep. By the time they reached the water, she had learned how to guide the mare in a slow turn, how to keep her back straight and her feet quiet. He walked beside her the whole way, only speaking when necessary. When they stopped to rest, she watched the creek tumble over smooth stones. "You believe in redemption?" she asked, voice low. Quillan leaned against a juniper trunk. "Not as a gift." "As work." "What kind of work?" "Same as mending fences, you keep showing up." She nodded slowly, watching the water catch in the light. That night, she sat at the table sewing a patch into the elbow of one of his shirts. He had dozed off in the chair by the fire, arms crossed, boots set neatly beside the hearth. She set the needle aside and walked to the window, looking out at the dark. The ring still sat on the sill, silver catching the glow from the coals. She reached for it, then paused. Instead, she turned and watched him sleep, the lines around his mouth soft in rest, the quiet weight of his presence filling the room. She didn't need to decide yet, but she knew somehow that he would still be there when she did. And that, after all she had given up to begin again, was more than she had ever dared ask. Quillan stood on the porch sharpening his pocket-knife, strokes slow and even against the whetstone. From where Florence sat beside the stove, she could hear the rasp of it even through the thick pine walls. The morning had come up cloudy but not cold, and the smell of early thaw clung to her damp hem. She set aside the sack of flour she'd been measuring and wiped her hands on her apron. A kettle hissed behind her. The silence between them had taken on a shape these last days neither strained nor distant, but steady, like the sound of wind moving through tall grass. She stepped onto the porch without her shawl. "You ever been south of here?" she asked, leaning her hip against the railing. Quillan didn't look up. "Spent a season down near Sweetwater, traded fence work for oats and salt. Did you like it?" He paused, then folded the knife into his palm. Too dry, hills looked like they'd been burned clean. Florence glanced toward the pines behind the barn. "I never saw land like this before. Back east, the trees grow tight together, like they're holding their breath." He turned the knife over in his hand once, examining the edge, then tucked it into his vest pocket. "My mother used to say the plains were too open," she continued. "Said there's nowhere to hide from yourself." Quillan stepped off the porch and crossed to the pump. He worked the handle until water spilled into the tin basin. "She wrong?" he asked. "No," Florence said. "But sometimes facing yourself's the only honest thing left." He dipped his hands, rubbed them briskly, and dried them on the cloth hung over the post. "There's a woman in town," she said, watching him. "Mrs. Bramley, widow, runs the schoolhouse." Quillan nodded once, barely perceptible. "She asked if I'd help with lessons, said they need someone with a steady hand at the slate when the weather turns." "You want to?" Florence caught the edge in his tone, not resistance, not quite surprise, just something cautious. "I do," she said. "It's quiet there." "The children listen, mostly." She hesitated, then added, "It feels like something I could build, not just tend to." He leaned against the pump post, arms crossed loosely. "You'll be back before dusk. I won't be kept past 3, she said, "and I'll see to supper same as always." He nodded slow. "Then that's fine." She stepped down into the yard. "You trust me to come back?" His gaze didn't waver. "I wouldn't have left the ring where you'd see it if I didn't." Florence walked to the barn for her coat, heart tugging in a way she hadn't named yet, but didn't push away either. The schoolhouse sat just beyond the dry creek, a squat building with a steep roof and 2 chimneys. Children ran shouting in the yard when she arrived. Inside, Mrs. Bramley stood at the blackboard, one shoulder hunched, chalk clutched close to the edge. "You're early," the older woman said, glancing over. "I wanted to see the place quiet," Florence replied. Mrs. Bramley motioned to the back room. "There's a stack of readers needs sorting, and the stove's been sulking all week." Florence rolled up her sleeves without another word. By the time the children filed in, cheeks red, boots clapping against the wood floor, she'd stoked the fire to a steady burn and laid out slates in neat rows. The room smelled of wood smoke and chalk, and something faintly sweet, probably the biscuits one of the children had smuggled in. At midday, she took her lunch outside, sitting on the steps with her feet tucked close. The air had warmed just enough to soften the ice along the fence posts. One of the boys, small, red-headed, missing a front tooth, sat beside her without asking. "You married to Mr. Everett?" he asked, mouth full of biscuit. "I live at his place," she said carefully. "I help him keep it. He chewed, then swallowed. He don't talk much. No, she agreed, but when he does, he means it. The boy nodded like that made enough sense. He fixed our wagon wheel last fall. Ma said he didn't even take payment. Florence folded her hands in her lap. He's like that. When she returned home, the sun was heavy behind the trees, gold slanting low between the trunks. As she stepped into the yard, she saw him on one knee near the chicken coop, one hand buried in the straw, the other cradling a speckled egg. She crossed to him. "You checking for hens or trying to charm them?" He stood, brushing straw from his trousers. "Hen laid early." "Thought I'd see if she made a habit of it." Florence took the egg from his palm, still warm. He didn't let go right away. She looked up. "You want to know how it went?" "I want to know if you'll keep going." She nodded. "I will." He stepped back, then reached into his pocket and handed her a slip of cloth. Inside, nestled in the fold, were 2 buttons bone, smooth and slightly mismatched. "Mrs. Danner said you'd asked after boots," he said. "These came off a coat someone left behind. She thought you'd make use of them." Florence closed the cloth around them. "Thank you." Quillan turned toward the house. "You'll need thread." "I have it," she said, following. "And the steady hands for it." As they stepped over the threshold together, the light from the hearth caught the edge of the ring still resting on the windowsill. Florence paused, then reached out not to take it but to set the cloth bundle beside it. "I'm not ready to wear it," she said. "But I wanted to have company." Quillan didn't reply, but he stood beside her until the fire burned down low. The air had turned soft by late April, the hard edges of winter worn down by sun and rain. Florence stood in the small garden behind the cabin, sleeves pushed to her elbows, fingertips dark with soil. Tiny shoots of green had begun to press through the dirt onion carrot and a short row of beans she'd planted with her own hands 4 days earlier. Quillan's boots crunched behind her, stopping just short of the garden's edge. "Fence held through the storm," he said. "No boards down." She glanced up, shading her eyes. "And the roof, dry." She nodded once and returned to smoothing the earth around a young sprout. "I'll need a bucket from town. The old one's split along the bottom." "I'll go in tomorrow," he said. Then, quietly, "You could come with me." Florence rocked back on her heels. "You ever been to the spring dance?" He folded his arms. "I've seen it from the edge of the field. That's not the same as going." He looked toward the distant hills where the light was beginning to shift gold. "I'm not much for crowds." She stood, brushing her palms against her skirts. "Neither am I. But I think I'd like to go." He didn't answer right away, only reached down and picked up the small tin pail beside her. "I'll tell Mrs. Danner to set aside the bucket," he said. "And I'll ask after a ribbon for your hair." She turned her head sharply, watching him walk back to the cabin with the pail swinging at his side. He hadn't said yes, not in so many words, but he hadn't said no. On the day of the dance, she wore her second-best dress, a deep blue cotton she'd re-hemmed after finding it bundled in a crate behind the mercantile. The boots she wore had been traded for the mending of a lace collar and 2 hours of sorting shelf stock. Her hair she pinned up with care, leaving 2 soft strands at her temples. Quillan waited outside the barn with both horses saddled. He had shaved close, the line of his jaw clean beneath his hat, and he wore a fresh shirt tucked tight into his belt. He looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "You'll turn heads in town." "I only need to turn one," she said. They rode in silence, the road wide and dry beneath the hooves. At the town green, lanterns had been strung between fence rails and the branches of the cottonwoods. Fiddles tuned from the porch of the schoolhouse. Children raced between the benches, and women in gingham dresses passed plates of fried cakes and beans. Florence dismounted without help, landing lightly in the dust. She watched Quillan tie off the reins before stepping beside her. "You don't have to dance," she said. He looked down at her. "But I could," she stepped closer, "if you wanted to." The first tune was a reel, fast and bright. She watched from the edge as he stood near, hands in his pockets, gaze following the movement of the dancers. When the music slowed, she placed a hand on his sleeve. "This one's kinder." He hesitated, then offered his arm. As they stepped onto the packed earth, the other dancers made space, not out of mockery but something quieter recognition, maybe. Florence placed one hand lightly on his shoulder, the other in his palm. He moved carefully, matching her steps, his grip sure but not possessive. "You're not terrible," she whispered. "I'm counting," he murmured back. "Are you?" "To 4, she smiled, her cheek brushing his coat as they turned. After the third song, they stepped away. She led him to the edge of the green, near the fence where lantern light gave way to shadow. "I never thought I'd find someone I didn't have to explain myself to," she said. He rested his hands against the rail. "I never thought I'd want to try again." She turned toward him. "I'm ready." He looked at her, eyes steady. "You sure?" "I've been sure for weeks," she said. "I just needed to know I could stand on my own first." He reached into his vest pocket and drew out the ring, its silver dulled slightly from handling. "Still yours if you want it." Florence took it and slid it onto her finger. It fit without resistance. "I do," she said. He leaned in, the brim of his hat brushing her forehead as he kissed her slow, certain, and without hesitation. They rode home late, the moon high and the horses moving slow. She leaned into him, wrapped in the warmth of his coat, the ring cool against her skin. 2 weeks later, they stood beneath the cottonwoods behind the cabin, Reverend Mallory beside them, dust on his boots and a book in his hands. Mrs. Danner and her husband brought a pie. Mrs. Bramley brought a hymn. The red-haired boy from the schoolhouse brought a wildflower he refused to give anyone but the bride. Florence wore her blue dress again, with a ribbon in her hair. Quillan wore the same shirt from the dance, sleeves rolled neatly to the elbow. The vows were short. Hands were clasped. Words were spoken that didn't need repeating. They ate on the porch, passed around slices of pie and fresh coffee. When the sun dipped low, the neighbors rode off, leaving the quiet behind. Inside, Florence untied her ribbon and placed it in the cedar chest. Quillan set a second chair beside the fire, close enough their knees touched when they sat. She reached for his hand, fingers threading with his. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said. He looked at her, eyes warm. "You never needed to be." The wind outside moved soft through the pines. The fire crackled low, and in the hush between one breath and the next, they began the life they had chosen together, steady and sure. Each morning after, Florence rose before the sun and made coffee while Quillan fed the animals. She read aloud to him in the evenings, her voice quiet at first, then stronger. He built her a frame for her mending, and she built him a second garden bed by the shed. They rode into town once a week, always side by side. And when the first frost came and the garden slept beneath straw, she wore his coat in the yard and planted bulbs that would bloom the following spring. He watched her from the porch, a mug in his hands, the ring on her finger catching the light. They had no need for more words. They had everything they needed already.